Hello, and welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. We are back today with Bo Lim, who's professor of Old Testament at Seattle Pacific University, for the second part of our discussion of the prophet Isaiah. Today we'll be talking about Isaiah chapter 40 and following. So thank you and welcome back, Bo. We really appreciated your conversation about first Isaiah. We're looking forward to what lies ahead. Wanted to start out by actually asking you about that transition, right? When we left off with chapter 39, the Babylonians were on the horizon. We knew that an experience of conquest and exile was ahead. And then we get to chapter 40 and it begins with this message of comfort, comfort, oh, comfort my people. What's happened here? What's this shift? Talk about what changes as we move into this part of the prophet's book.
Yes, it's this incredible transition, a very jarring transition in chapter 40. And here, I mentioned in my previous talk that we have anthologies, and so these books don't always read that smoothly. And it is a little bit of an odd shift in that we're not told what happens to Israel. It just assumes. 40 begins with comfort my people, and it just assumes that the exile has taken place. And catch this, the announcement of 40 is that it's over. So the trauma, the horror, the deportation, all that, and I've been told you read 1 and 2 Kings. 1 and 2 Kings tells that story toward the end, but Isaiah just assumes it, just assumes that all of that has taken place, and now we're in this new era, and it's the great announcement of Isaiah is that exile is over. Israel has, Jerusalem has served double, paid double for all her sins, and so this is good news. This is the word, actually, euangelion will show up several times in the Greek translation of the of the Hebrew Bible. It'll show up several times here. And this is the good news that Isaiah now sort of fast forwards and jumps to, and he just assumes that, yeah, all that horror of exile has taken place. But now we're in this new era of God's salvation.
What are some of the images of that good news? I mean, what's the language that Isaiah uses to describe what's happening here?
So recall what Israel was experiencing earlier in the book. They were a desolate land. They were besieged. They were on fire. And all of this meant that the Assyrians would and empires back then would conquer. And this would oftentimes, they would pillage you. They would starve cities out. Some of the Bible speaks of cannibalism taking place because the cities are starving. This is all pre-cannons and so forth. And so, they would go and besiege a city, and they have high walls. So it's actually hard to sort of attack, think Lord of the Rings here, right? It's hard to actually, attack high walls. So they kind of besiege it for weeks and months and starve people out. And here too, this is Babylon. These are exiles who have been taken to Babylon, who then have to, if they want to go home, trek back. And so all to say is the images are of a desert. They're of wasteland. That's the condition that they've experienced. And what is redemption like? It's the transformation of the wilderness. It's of a garden. It's of actually a new creation. And all of these things speak to actual lived reality, a lived reality of war, a lived reality of forced migration, a lived reality of, one of the images of heaven that shows up a lot in Isaiah, and I think we foodies will like, it's food, right? I mean, now we foodies will get excited. No, but this is images of heaven to a starving people. Yeah. Right? That's why these images show up. And so, yeah, you have all this images of a new creation throughout the section of Isaiah.
Say more too about how the return isn't just back to fix an old city, but now it's going to become Zion, and the nations are going to want to come to it. It's not just we're going to rebuild our little city over in this part of the world, but it's going to become somehow the center of the universe. There's a kind of pride there or something, or a kind of hope, right? What's going on there?
So here once again, you have poetry and descriptions and a vision that, like I mentioned, the return is described as a transformation of this, as of a new creation. You have then, and I've spoken earlier about how this book is about the city of Jerusalem, about Zion. So now what is to take place in the great announcement in Isaiah 40 and following is not only the Babylonian deportees to return home to Jerusalem, but it's actually an ingathering of all Jews from north, east, and south. You'll get this in some of the passages that talk about the servants. So an ingathering of all of God's people who've been dispersed and displaced. And then they will come back to a restored Jerusalem where, you're actually right. We've heard about this restored Jerusalem. We read about in like chapter 2 earlier of a Jerusalem that brings justice and righteousness to the nations. So there's peace with the nations. There are some curious passages that are going to be challenging to interpret, though, that also speak about the glorification of Jerusalem, both over and against the nations. So they both bring justice to the nations, but there are also passages that speak about the nations. And understand this: the nations who had been oppressing them, conquering them, right, deporting them, these are their Syrians, and now visions of the nations coming in submission and peace, and in some cases, though, bringing their wealth to Jerusalem.
The wealth of nations, right?
Yeah.
That's right. We have been, I think, consistently reminded in these, especially in our scholar interviews, that these are texts written by survivors. That's where a lot of this imagery is coming out of, that experience, for sure. But I love the sort of the nuance with which you portray the different ways in which this kind of glorification is imagined. I'm wondering if you can speak to us to shift gears a little bit, just historically, about why is this return happening? What's transpired kind of on the world stage to bring it about? And then how does that historical narrative show up in the prophetic book itself?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that the book of Isaiah spans a sort of Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires, sort of 8th to 5th centuries. And then again, there's debate about, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, that kind of thing. And huge shifts geopolitically have taken place. So Assyria, the Babylonians defeat the Assyrians, and so they're the world power, roughly 612 or so BC. So they then are the ones who, it's just one bully after another, though, right? So you get one, you get one gang beat another gang, and now they're the ones that Israel has to deal with. So the Babylonians then besiege Jerusalem. What they do is they actually don't want to just immediately conquer and destroy you. They actually want you to survive because they want your taxes, right? They want your taxes. So that's what initially happens to Jerusalem. And actually, the book of Jeremiah actually deals more about the geopolitical politics with Jerusalem and Babylon. Why do they finally destroy you? When you revolt. When you go, okay, no, we're going to revolt against you, Babylon. Then they'll say, oh, okay, if you're going to do that, then we'll destroy you. So 586, this is the huge catastrophe, the major cataclysmic event in the Old Testament, hands down, the Babylonian exile. I mean, it is there's lots of traumatic events that happen to Israel throughout the Old, but this is the one that in many ways, and it will be the paradigmatic trauma, because even later on, even when you get to the New Testament, you hear about Babylon, Babylon, and Rome is then sort of spoken of in these terms. So Babylon will be sort of the paradigmatic like evil empire, and they will deport, they will decimate the city. Many will be killed. Actually, a minority will actually be taken to Babylon. The majority will be refugees scattered about, so forth. And there you will have, a group of largely elites who are in Babylon, and sort of the stories of Daniel and that kind of thing kind of at least portray their possible existence there. And actually, though, it's not that long, because in 539, a huge geopolitical shift takes place. Cyrus, the Persian king, defeats Babylon, takes over Babylon. There's a lot of instability within the Babylonian Empire, and he kind of plays upon that. And he comes into Babylon and he inherits these Jews and he says, go home, go home. And interestingly enough, the book of Isaiah in 44 and 45, here's what's the prophet here, one of his tasks is trying to convince the people. His message is, it's over. Exile is over. Go home. Cyrus is God's anointed. Listen to Cyrus. Listen to Cyrus. But the people refuse to leave. That's his problem. That's actually the problem that's occurring in 40 and following, is that the people don't want to come home. They've gotten comfortable in Babylon. And what had they gotten comfortable with? Babylonian idolatry. And know this, when we talk about idols, it's not, it's all that it represents. So all the economic, political comforts and security and powers and all that Babylon. And I can understand you've been cared for by the superpower of your day, and to go back to my old decimated city, trekking miles, I don't know, that seems scary to me. And so this is the big dilemma that's happening in 40 and following.
Yeah.
I'm struck by, like you said, that's like the traumatic event of the Older Testament. And the whole notion of forced migration and return is so powerful. I think, apparently we're at a time where the UN says more people are displaced forcibly right now than ever in the history of the world. And that's a story that meaningfully connects with a lot of Americans, but a lot of Americans it does not meaningfully connect. I mean, so how does that, do you have thoughts about that theological theme and how it still resonates today in different audiences, and how we can maybe learn to appreciate that theme better?
Yeah. It's sad today is that there are whole new disciplines, academic disciplines, that have sprung up within the past several decades. So like forced migrations have like a journal. There are you can get degrees on this, because exactly what you mentioned, Matt, within the past several decades, the amount of people that have been displaced forcibly, I'm going to say forcibly due to, a variety, it could be natural, it can be human disaster, so forth. I mean, the numbers are sadly staggering in our day. And I bring this up because it's interesting. So studies on this have shown the effects of these realities. And I think I mentioned before, it's hunger, disease, but so not only the sort of the physical difficulties that people will experience, but and that's true, but the social effects, the psychological effects. Here's what's fascinating. So, in say chapter 54, right? 54, it speaks of Zion. And sing, O barren one who did not bear, burst into song and shout, you who have not been in labor, for the children of the desolate woman will be no more than the children of her that is married, says the Lord. Enlarge the size of your tent. So Zion is pictured as a woman who's barren. What happens in times of war? Who are the most vulnerable? Women and children. And so Isaiah speaks to this, and here's what happens also in times of war. Families are displaced. You will find children who don't know who their mother or father is because they had to literally flee a village. I actually, one time I was teaching on the prophets, and I had an older gentleman in my class. He had survived the Khmer Rouge, and he literally told us, like, shared with our story, like, they invaded my village and I literally just ran. He spent years then in a refugee camp on the border, and then that border though was like a no man's land, and so it was like the place where everyone dropped their bombs. He then later on managed to, after years of being in a refugee camp, managed to immigrate to the United States. And then he doesn't even know, like, what happened to my dad. Like, where's my family? Finally reunited with his sister, and then finally finds out that his father had been killed and so forth. And so, I was like, you've lived what Isaiah speaks about, what this literature speaks about. And when you read First Chronicles, so I'll say you get strong themes of barrenness and families and so forth. And interestingly, when you read First Chronicles, which talks to a people coming out of exile, what do you read in Chronicles? A ton of genealogies. That's a common theme in the Bible, but why especially coming out of exile? Because you have no idea whose family. You're trying to reestablish your family heritage. And so this is the reality of a people whose population has been drastically reduced, and the notions of their immediate families, these ties have been cut for so many. So this is all over these texts, and what's sad is, like, my student, like, these are, for some of us, we experience this in metaphorical ways, and I believe God speaks to that. But there are literally people who are experiencing this, literally experiencing that in our world today. And I think these texts help us to have solidarity with such folks, and some of these folks help me read the Bible better.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is a beautiful and haunting sort of reminder of the reality behind these, and the reality that of what people are facing today. And that has come, that theme has come again and again in these texts. I mean, even just beginning with our understanding of Exodus and even Genesis and what came before then. So thank you for that. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the figure of the suffering servant that we encounter here.
Yeah.
Who is that figure within these texts? How is that figure understood in later traditions, Christian and otherwise? What's happening there?
So the servant shows up as extremely prominent. It's not, if not the major theme, in chapters 40 through 55 and so forth. And it's a mysterious figure. So that's one thing that just always strikes me. Like, why didn't God name who this is? But God chose not to, and I think that's purposeful. So so to me, I'm like, okay, there's a purpose in this. In many ways, this, Israel. So God will call the servant Israel. Jacob, my friend, will identify the servant as Abraham. We'll get descriptions about what the servant does. He brings light to the nations, so forth. Well, also, like I mentioned before, though, sometimes God will say, my servant is blind and deaf. And so God's frustrated with the servant as well. So now what's interesting, though, is you are introduced to this person, and we later find out he's Cyrus. He's literally named. But you also are introduced to this person who's going to help Israel, going to redeem Israel, who's referred to as God's righteous right hand. And so you're introduced to the Cyrus figure. So this is a little bit odd that's going on. So I'll say you're not the servant person right from the get-go is left unnamed. We're introduced, I think, initially chapter 41. And then you're also introduced to this Cyrus figure who's going to help Israel come back from the nations. But then after chapter 48, I'll say this, Cyrus drops off. Never hear about him again. And you continue to hear about this servant. And you hear about this ongoing ministry of the servant. And here's now where it gets a little more personal, where the servant seems less as a big collective, as a sort of collective for all of Israel. And it sounds like a person who's persecuted and mocked and spit at. And then by chapter 53, ultimately is humiliated and put to death. And again, though, not named. And here's a curious thing of 53. 53, which is the sort of class, it's one of the most quoted passages in the New Testament. It's read at Good Friday services, Christians will attribute it to Jesus. It is curious, though. It's narrated in the third person and about events that happened in the past. It doesn't read like it certainly doesn't read like a future prophecy. Right. It refers to it's some people talking about what's happened. This person has died. It's all in the past tense. And yet through the suffering and death of the servant, many are made righteous. And interestingly enough, too, all these servant passages that particularly happen in the sort of 42, 49, 50, 53, it's paralleled with Zion passages. Lady Zion shows up as a figure. And so through the suffering and death of the servant, Lady Zion is finally redeemed. So I throw it all out. I've been more descriptive than perhaps prescriptive, all to say that, it's a little fuzzy. It's unclear. Like, who is this? Could it be a collective? And that's how a lot of Jews interpret the sufferings. It's Israel who has suffered. Right? Israel is God's servant. Interestingly enough, Daniel, in the book of Daniel 11 and 12, refers to a group of people who suffer, who are wise. All this language that shows up in 53, who suffer and make many righteous. So it sounds like this collective group of people. Again, that's another. And obviously, I think if you read your New Testament authors will make it clear, First Peter and so forth, that Jesus is the one. I'll say this though at the end. What's less clear is exactly who it is, but what is more clear is what the servant does. That's what's clear. The servant suffers and dies. The servant brings light and justice and so forth. So that's what's more clear in the text. Exactly who it is. Certainly God working through Israel, but is it all of Israel? Is it one amongst Israel? Is it a group within Israel? That's what's left opaque in the text.
Well, thank you for illuminating that opaqueness.
Have fun with it.
I appreciate answers that open more possibility, and I feel like that's what this one does. Matt, did you have a question?
I was just gonna say I had an Old Testament professor who taught on this and said, kind of did what you did and said, this is not Jesus. This is something else. And then I went to his office hours. There were a bunch of us who were invited to have lunch in his office, and he goes, Yeah, it sure sounds like Jesus. Which I appreciate, because his point was, right, when you read it with Christian lenses, when you read this at certain times of the year in the Christian calendar, for example, not that it has to be Jesus, but you go, oh, this sheds light now on how the death of Jesus is more than just a catastrophe, that something can actually be taking place here, that there's a mystery that Jesus participates in that's bigger than just any one text, right? And
Yeah.
but I don't know, maybe there's something there about reading Isaiah this time of year as well, but go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say one of my favorite stories in the New Testament is Matthew 11, where John is in prison and he sends out his disciples and he's not sure. Are you the one to, or are you the one, or is there one still to come? Like John the Baptist, the greatest among the prophets.
Yeah.
He's not sure. So I think it gives us a little bit of comfort. And yeah, as I read this, it's you're trying to, there's a lot of dots, and like, how do you actually connect them, though? That's in many ways we're left to do, and that's a task that Jesus gives us as his followers.
Yeah. And maybe the poet would say, whoever asked you to connect the dots and make just one photograph or one picture out of it, that maybe there's. But,
oh yeah, oh absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Well, we have a couple of minutes left here. I did want to ask you briefly. So looking at the sort of overall arc of this half, we're talking about chapters 40 and following. How should we think about the different voices and perspectives that are lifted up here? I think tradition is often also, scholarly tradition will say, has often also said there's a sort of a third Isaiah voice here towards the tail end. How do you understand the composition of this part of the whole?
Yeah. So scholars have asserted then, just as I mentioned, the chapter 40 and following is such a huge shift that perhaps someone else wrote 40. And then once you do that, someone else came along and said, maybe chapter 56 to 66 sounds different than what has happened. And so some have attributed 56 to 66 as to a Persian era. Now, I'll say this, it's more apparent that at least as much that 40 and following seems to be in a Babylonian setting, because Cyrus is named and so forth. And so there's some debate about exactly 56 and 66. But here's what I'd love for folks as you read these books is I think if you have a chance to read 66, you will notice, okay, there's a lot of similarity with what happened before, but then there are certain things that seem a little different. All of a sudden, if you read 56 and 66, here's the dilemma you'll face. You're like, wait a minute. 40 and following sounded like the good news is here, God's here to redeem us and so forth. And you read 56 and go, and like, gosh, why is there's all the sin and idolatry? And it's going to sound awfully like the beginning of the book of Isaiah. So you're kind of like, wait a minute, are we back where we started? And you'll hear about being back in the land and a temple and so forth. So and this is why some suggest that this is back in the Persian period. Here's one ongoing theme, though, is that you'll see this movement from now. God, the servant will say this: the servant's death and resurrection will make many righteous. And so, whereas the servant theme perhaps it summarizes sort of 40 to 55, you'll hear a lot of talk of the servants, plural. So it seems that what the servant did, it was give birth to servants. And 56 through 66 then they'll be good and bad. There'll be these glorious messages of a new heavens and new earth, particularly. But I'll go back to what I mentioned in chapter when we discussed 1 to 39. Evil is awfully persistent, just doesn't seem to get away. Injustice and idolatry still linger. And so finally, what happens is you do have God who says, okay, I got to take care of this. And so, and so God is going to bring a final judgment and redemption. But Isaiah, I'll say, it leaves us a little hanging because, gosh, there's some there's glorious parts in this section. And there's some scary parts too, though. Very scary. Yeah.
Absolutely. Gosh, well, I wish I could say we're going to have you back next week to resolve all of that. But this is where
that's your
Isaiah
job.
ends. Yeah, there's no chapter 67 for another. Yeah. But this has just been a wonderful conversation, an absolute delight. It's like an early Advent present, and we are really, really grateful for your presence with us. I think this will help our congregation as we're moving through these scriptures just to go even deeper. So thank you so much. We really, really appreciate this conversation, Bo. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, and I'm just excited that people are studying Isaiah.